Thank you so much for the presentation. I think they are all, you presented your sides very nicely. Let me ask each one of you a question that relates to what the other speakers have said. We begin with Sam. Sami Ratner presented us with an account about the conflict. What the roots of the conflict. It's not about land, it's not about, but the Israelis are looking for a peace partner. What is to you, why are the Israelis and Palestinians fighting, from your perspective?
Okay. Well, it's about land, period. I mean, you know, if you own the land, you're the king, you're the landlord. Any suggestion that it's not about land, it's really, it's either, with all due respect, dishonest or completely, intended to be, it's misinformed. It's land, period, resources, money, control. Just like here, if you're a landlord, you can control the tenants, etc. You can do whatever you want. So that's basically what it is. I mean, they misappropriated the majority of Palestine by force, by disinformation. Terrorism in Palestine was introduced not by the Palestinians, by the Zionist gangs, the Haganah, the Ergon. Ishaq Shamir, who became the prime minister, was a terrorist wanted by the British government. 2 or 3 others, which I forgot the name, they were posters, wanted, terrorism. They blew the King David Hotel, they killed the Swedish diplomat, Bernadotte, that's his name, I have to brush up on these things. But it is about land, and that's what it is. And by the way, before I forget, I do have my newspaper out there. It's called the Independent Monitor. The last 2 issues, October, November, December. Feel free to have them. Thank you.
It's a good publicity. Okay. And there are other literature on the back. Ratner, you talk about there is no one there to talk with. There is no Palestinian partner. Esther's talk actually gives us a lot of proposition that there are actually people there who want to talk to Israel. What's your response to that?
Well, I think there are. Is this on? Can you hear me? I think there are many Palestinians that we could talk to. Unfortunately, that they're being suppressed by their own leadership. Just this week, I think an organization that you're involved with tried to hold a conference. Sarah Naseba tried to hold a conference about the Confederation concept in Jerusalem, and they were stopped from holding that by Palestinian Authority police and demonstrators who actually disrupted their attempt to hold a meeting and destroyed a lot of their materials. I think that there are a lot of grassroots effort on the ground between Israelis and Palestinians to try to get a dialogue going. I'm a great believer in what Prime Minister Netanyahu has stated. I think economic development is one of the ways where, first of all, the lives of the Palestinians and the Israelis can be benefited. And we've seen a big boom in the West Bank. I've traveled through the West Bank extensively in the last couple of years. I mean, I call it Crane City. If you go to Ramallah, there's buildings going up, there's a new community being built. And I think if we could work on the grassroots, I don't disagree with what Estee said. If we could work on the grassroots and have a way to continue the economic development without the interference of the PA, and this is leaving aside the whole question of what we do with Gaza and Hamas, because they're committed to violence and the destruction of Israel. Maybe we can move forward. So I'm willing to explore that. A lot of Israelis are willing to explore that, and the Israeli government's willing to explore it. So I don't think that it's unreasonable to assume that a lot of Israelis and the Israeli government would be willing to talk to these people if they weren't cut off, their legs were cut off by their own leadership.
I see the same question to you. You raise a very, very good question. The idea is that we need to move towards non-violence. If we hear from Ratner, these organizations have not done a good job. They are divided, they are not, they don't actually want to do peace. And the Israeli government is ready and willing to do it. Is that the case?
Well, I'm not an academic, but I think it's clear that since the peace process began, it has proved itself to be exactly that, a process. The questions have not changed. At the end of the 1800s, when the Zionist movement began, it was about going to Israel and taking back their, historical homeland and making a Jewish state there. And it did begin, as it was stated, violently. And it has continued to be a violent movement until now. It's true that there have been violence on both sides, but there is a very, very vibrant nonviolent movement in the Palestinian territories, and what it takes for something like that to gain traction is for us to pay attention. If our media is only reporting a rocket attack that killed nobody, but hit a town in Israel, then instead of portraying these nonviolent actions that happen every Friday, instead of showing the violence that these nonviolent protesters are met with by the Israeli forces, then of course Americans are going to have a skewed perception of what the conflict is. It's a conflict over land, and when the UN decided to create two states, you had people in the region who, prior to the Zionist movement coming over, had lived as peacefully together as any other place in the world. It was the people coming over and by force taking villages and taking land and,
Purchasing.
I'm sorry?
Purchasing land.
And sometimes purchasing land, but there were people who didn't purchase land. There were many incidents where land was taken. The people of the area, when the British Empire were taken out, thought that they were going to have self-determination. They thought that they were going to rule themselves. And when they were told that actually 65% of the land was going to be given to a 10 or 15% minority of the population, you can imagine why some people said, no. So it is a conflict over land. And at this point, there's no question as to who is using overwhelming force and who doesn't have the means to do that. I don't want to give the impression that there aren't non-violent actions and organizations working from within Israel, because there are. And our organization works with both Israeli nonviolent activists and Palestinian nonviolent activists. We believe that that's how we come up with peace.
Any questions from the audience? And I can back.
First of all, thank you. This was a very good presentation. My question is, nobody doubts that there are individuals and organizations and lots of people on both sides who want peace or are willing to talk peace. But the bottom line is we need people that can actually make the deal to give security to both sides. And that, to me, seems to be the issue. Not whether or not there are people that want peace. And what do we do to ensure that that will happen?
Is there a specific person?
I have a peace
I think
plan.
everybody has that.
Thank you very much. Incidentally, if you want to get a lot of information about Palestine, just befriend me on Facebook, Sami Mashney. Very active page. You see a lot of videos that are truthful, and you have a lot of answers to your question. Now, as far as, and I also like to mention two books written by Israelis, Jewish Israelis, that take it from the horse's mouth in terms of what's happening. The first one is The Forgotten Palestinians of Israel by Professor Alan Ferdman, a renowned Israeli professor, The Forgotten Palestinians of Israel. And the second one is The Wandering Who by Gilad Atzmon, an Israeli living in Britain, and he's a dissident as far as what Zionism is in Palestine. As far as the answer to your question, lady, I think peace can be accomplished this way. Number one, similar to what happened here in the United States, it has to be an agreement, a reconciliation between the Palestinians and the Israelis in terms of, in the beginning, the security and the military can remain in the hands of the Israelis, because any sudden change in security and etc. is going to cause people to be insecure, nervous, their hands are on the trigger, everybody's on each other's throat. So it's not easy in the beginning to affect security and the military. But what's going to happen is this: there has to be affirmative action plans to give the Palestinians back a lot of what they lost in terms of land and economy as a result of the Zionist onslaught on Palestinians. There has to be a program, a phased-out program in stages where in the beginning it's economic, social, etc., etc. Then when this will cause the tensions between the Palestinians and the Israelis to start to subside, becoming less acute, less problematic, then slowly but surely the Palestinians will be integrated in the security and the military force, over there without division, without any sudden movements. And then the Israelis will find out that the Palestinians are their best allies. And once there's reconciliation, peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis, most of the problems around Israel will subside, because the Arab and the Muslim people are angry because they see their Arab brethren and the predominantly Muslim Palestinians being hit on the head since 1948 till now. That's going to cause people to be very angry. Imagine you, for example, if Canada or Mexico comes and invades and occupies California, beats on California, take their land, subjugates them, etc., 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 over 60 years. Don't you imagine that Americans will be up at arms, they want to go kill the Mexicans and the Canadians? That's what's happening in Palestine.
First of all, I'd like to respond to this whole question of land. What I mean by land is the Israeli government has, especially in Prime Minister Olmert's last offer, agreed to give back almost 100% of the West Bank. So when you talk about giving back land and the Palestinians rejecting that offer, it can't be about land, number one. Number two, I would dispute the whole concept of the occupation. These are, in international law, these are disputed territories, just like Kashmir is a disputed territory. There was no Palestinian state. What Israel conquered in the '67 war was an occupation by Jordan of the West Bank from '47 to '67, which wasn't recognized by the world, only recognized by two countries in the world, Jordan and Pakistan. So if there would have been a Palestinian state, we could talk about the Palestinians being the people who lived there before, but it wasn't. It was the Jordanians. The last thing I want to say is to get further along in any kind of reconciliation, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas definitely, but the Palestinian Authority, this is something that doesn't get reported as much as it should. The amount of incitement against not only Israelis, but against Jews is just appalling. In their mosques, in their speeches, in their school books, and in what they do with children in their camps. The hatred that is inculcated into the young people in the Palestinian territories is just unbelievable. And until we get a generation of people brought up without hating the Jewish people or the Israelis, we're never going to get anywhere. So then we need to change the school books, we need to change what the sermons are, we need to change what the leadership says in Arabic, not in English. And even President Abbas at the UN just last month denied the right of the Jewish people's whole heritage in the historic patrimony of the Jewish people when he talked about Christian and Muslim rights and didn't mention any Jewish rights whatsoever. So there's this attempt to deny the connection between the Jewish people and their 3,000-year connection. And Jewish people lived in that land continuously for 3,000 years. And in 1870, there was a majority Jewish population in Jerusalem. And if you read Mark Twain, you read other accounts, Roger Kipling, you read the Peel Report and other British mandate officials, you'll see that the Israelis, or the Jews, they were called the Yeshuv at that time, didn't steal land. When I go to a place like Ariel, which is a so-called settlement, it was an empty place. There were no Palestinians living there. Nobody stole anybody's land. It was either bought or it was land that had been under the Turkish administration or the British administration that fell to the Israeli administration. And so that this myth of stealing land is just not true.
You needn't look any further than the Palestine papers, which were made public, and some WikiLeaks documents were made public, to understand, in spite of what some people would like to characterize as the Palestinians not agreeing to peace, those documents about the negotiations clearly show which side has walked away from every agreement that was ever close to being met. Understand that what the Palestinians had accepted, but the plan that was walked away from by the Israelis, was 22% of historic Palestine. 22%. And you can look up for yourselves the history of the movement and the land and how it was taken. You don't need me to tell you that. The thing I want to say about peace, no justice, no peace. As long as there's no justice, peace cannot happen. But when they know justice, I promise you, all peoples in the land will know peace.
A couple things. I want to thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I do have a question for everybody else. I'd like to direct it to Gary to start with, but I just want to make a comment. Again, I appreciate you here. There's a lot of scorekeeping going on, a lot of history and blame, and I understand that and I feel it, but I think hopefully at some point we can move beyond that towards a solution, because there are people who hate on both sides and people who demonize on both sides. There's a lot of bad history on both sides. So towards that end, I want to ask about the Arab League Peace Initiative, which was put forth about 10 years ago, and I just happened to stumble across it in the paper. We're like, what is this? As I understand it, Saudi Arabia and the 22 members of the Arab League put forth a peace proposal in which every Arab nation, including the Palestinians, agreed to it. They said they would recognize Israel's right to exist at the 67 borders, defend their right to exist. In exchange, Israel would return to the 67 borders. Obviously, the refugee problem remains an issue, but that was part of it. So I guess, starting with Gary, and I hear you, Gary, say that Israel is basically ready to give up that land. Why did that proposal gain no traction in Israel? What's wrong with that proposal? Why doesn't it provide a good starting point?
There were two problems with that proposal. Number one, nobody was willing to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, and that's the key. The key is the Jewish people are entitled to a homeland. We can go through the history, I don't want to go through the history. But a Jewish state, okay? And even Abbas, even Arafat, no one on the other side has recognized Israel as a Jewish state, number one. And number two, they were talking about a massive return of the so-called refugees, the right of return, which would destroy the Jewish character of Israel, and no Israeli, and no one was going to accept that in Israel. So we can, you can say whatever you want about it. The reality is Israel isn't going away. It's a very powerful country, and the BDS movement isn't going to succeed. And Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel isn't going anywhere. It's going to be there for a long time. And until people recognize it as a Jewish state and give up this idea, maybe there should be some token family reunification, which there was under the Olmert plan and even the Barak plan. And if you look at, you can talk about the WikiLeaks papers, but if you look at Dennis Ross's book and you look at other people's books who were involved in the negotiations at Camp David and at Taba and with Olmert, you'll see that the Arab side was blamed, not the Israeli side. So that's the problem with the Arab peace plan, the Saudi Arab peace plan.
I too often point that out to people that there is a plan that has been on the table. When I talk to my friends in Israel about the notion that came up about that same time when Israel was demanding to be a Jewish state, they say to me this: non-Jews in Israel are somewhere between 20 and 25% of the population within 48. Imagine if in America, where the Jewish population is just under 2%, if America were to declare itself a Christian nation. How loud would the outcry from Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists be? So, by declaring Israel a Jewish state, what does that do to 20% of the population who aren't Jewish?
Excellent point. I would like to mention something. Gary said there was no Palestine. I have a coin with me here, a replica of a coin, and I would like to ask Gary what languages are.
Yeah, it's in Arabic and it's in Hebrew and it says Palestine.
And English.
Yes, in English.
What year?
1934.
So there was such a thing as Palestine.
Yeah, and it was the Jews who were called the Palestinians in those days.
So
I mean, Palestinian post. My in-laws have passports that say Palestinians, and that referred to the Jews. The Palestinians didn't consider themselves. The Arab people didn't consider themselves Palestinians until 1964.
So Gary's saying that the Jews consider themselves Palestinians, and the Palestinians who call themselves today did not consider themselves Palestinians then. If you want to believe that, I can sell you the Brooklyn Bridge for sure.
Well, I can show you documentation that will prove it.
Okay, so there's a lot of drivel, there's a lot of propaganda that's really fueling the existence of Israel. Israel was a state that was created on two prongs. One of them is mass propaganda, the other one is, mass terrorism. And then the worst part about it is that they blamed the victims, the Palestinians, as they are the terrorists, they are the ones who are bad, etc., which is a classic case of blaming the victim. Gary mentioned the Balfour Declaration in 1918, where Lord Balfour of England made a promise to give Jews a homeland in Palestine. But there was a very important, number one, who gave the British the godly right to offer land that belongs to somebody else, to a third party, number one. Number two, a very important prong of that promise was that said that, quote unquote, I'm paraphrasing, that none of this promise should affect in any way the right of the existing native population, the Palestinians. This provision, the Zionists completely forgot about it. Say, oh yeah, we have a homeland. Forget about this second provision. It's not really important. I'll be with you in a minute, sir. Now, to have a Jewish state, that's an apartheid state. If Gary wants a Jewish state in Israel, then we need a Christian state here in the United States. Would you accept to be in a Christian state and you become a second-class citizen? This is hypocrisy. Any American Jew who is enjoying the secularism and the separation of church and state in the United States, who is advocating a Jewish state, is a hypocrite per se. There's no other way to explain it. You cannot have, multiple personalities. Here, I am secular, I believe in Church of State. Over there, no, I am Jewish, it's our heritage, it's our biblical right. If somebody believes in that, then they need to shrink, in my opinion.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
I just got called various things. First of all, Israel is a Jewish democracy, and despite what other people may think, Arab Israelis do have lots of rights. I would submit, Israel is a democracy for 60 years. I think if you look at the history of democracies, the Arab Israelis have more rights than a lot of minorities have had in democracies in the past. And secondly, what about all the Muslims? What about the fact that Yasser Arafat and Abbas say that no Jew can live in Palestine? Why should the people, the 300,000 or 400,000 settlers that live there, who may want to, if there is a Palestinian state, why can't they stay there? Why does it have to be Judenreich? Why is Saudi Arabia a Muslim state? There are 20 Muslim states that don't recognize any other religion. You can't have a church in Saudi Arabia. There are many countries that are based on a religious basis. Israel has 15 official religions, okay? The Baha'i have their headquarters there, the Saisians are there, the Druze are there, Christians are there, Muslims are there, and Israel was the one who's protected the rights of all the three monotheistic religions in Jerusalem. Between 47 and 67, no Jew could go to the holiest places. So you talk about denying the rights of the Jewish people. It was the Jordanian Arabs and other Arabs that did that. But we can get into all these arguments. The question is, where do we go from here? How do we achieve peace going forward? That's what I would like to talk about. And until, just let me finish this one sentence, and until the Palestinian leadership or a new leadership comes into being that is willing to accept a Jewish majority state with full rights for minorities, then there's no hope. And the incitement's got to stop, and the violence has to stop. You talk about violence. In the 30s, it was in the 20s, it was the massacre of Jews in Hebron. It was al-Husseini, who was a friend of Nasser, who perpetrated genocide against Jews who were living there. So.
Just quickly, I want to say that, as Gary says, a Jewish majority state. How, in a true democracy, do you control the population to maintain the 80% Jewish majority that they want to maintain? If it's one person, one vote, then it's one person, one vote. If the policy is to restrict people from coming in to maintain a certain ethnic balance, then I'm not sure. My dictionary doesn't call that a democracy.
Under the religious debate, this is a new issue that came recently with Lieberman taking over. Up to, and I want a reaction of three of you. The Oslo Agreement, the Oslo Agreement, to the extent of one memorandum agreement under Netanyahu, even under Ehud Barak, and you could even after, with all the exception of Olmert, there was always a belief that two-state solution did not have a religious denomination. Yitzhak Rabin, for example, negotiated with the Palestinian national leader Yasser Arafat on the basis of two-state solution. For you, the question to you is, why is this change in the terminology? Why, since, I would say maybe 2 years ago, when Lieberman took over, this issue of the Jewish state has surfaced? And I'll get to you, Sami, with another question.
I don't believe it's changed. I mean, the Balfour Declaration in 17 talked about a Jewish state. The UN partition plan talked about a Jewish state and an Arab state.
The question is specifically, Yitzhak Rabin, a prime minister of the Israeli, assassinated, was not a Jewish state, talking about an Israeli state.
He's claiming that Yitzhak Rabin talked about an Israeli state. I don't think that's an accurate assessment. He was talking about a Jewish state.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
I have a question.
Sami, I'll get to you. I'll get to you in a second. Sami, very briefly, Hamas talk about the religious state, Hamas pushes for a religious state, and Hamas wants to destroy the Jewish state. Is that a fair statement?
Well, Hamas is the spitting image of Zionism. Hamas is a reaction to Zionism. If there was no Israel, there would not have been Hamas. Hamas came to the scene last 20 or 25 years. Israel came to the scene in 1948. Now, when you have a Zionist movement that came, took over, Judaized the whole Palestine, made it an Israeli state, wouldn't you think that the predominantly Muslim population, after they tried nationalism, after they tried socialism, after they tried communism, after they tried pan-Arabism, and all these things failed, okay, well, let's try Islamicism, and that's what's going on here. And I want to tell you a story that happened to me personally. Around 1980 or so, 1978, I was going to Jerusalem with a friend of mine, early in the morning. And we were flagged down by an Israeli jeep. Okay. We stopped, of course you have to stop. Then as we stopped, the Israeli jeep were distributing pamphlets in Arabic. I looked at them and it says, Nida, Nida, Nida. This is what Hamas stuff. Their first leaflet number 1, was being distributed by Israeli soldiers. Why? Divide and conquer. Divide the Palestinian society between seculars, the PLO, and Islamists. And by the way, seculars and Islamists are like cats and dogs. They're not allies. I mean, I'm a secular person. I consider sectarians, I don't want to use the term enemies, but extreme adversaries. So they managed to split Palestinian society between sectarians like Hamas and seculars like the PLO. And that's why you have Gaza right now under the control of sectarians like Hamas, and the West Bank under the control of seculars. You know, this has been happening before. In Egypt, for example, Al-Ikhwan Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, they were introduced to the scene by British intelligence so that the sectarians will fight against the seculars. Gamal Abdel Nasser is divide and conquer. Hamas was initially started and supported and encouraged by Israel. They never knew it was going to get that strong and be like a thorn in their back. But you need to understand history and know how things happened before. I'm against Hamas, you know, but if I have to choose being against Hamas and against Zionism, of course, Zionism predates Hamas, and we have to get rid of Zionism first, then we get to Hamas.
There's the answer. Let's take the question from the floor.
Thank you very much, and I truly appreciate the information that all of you brought. Personally, my own knowledge of this issue is sketchy, to put it charitably. So I have a basic question. In the United States, there are no ethnic or religious tests for citizenship. What kind of test is in place for Israeli citizenship? And number two, at the time that Israel was founded, if I were a resident of the area, what would have happened to my ability to participate in the new state, depending on what my ethnic or religious heritage might be at that time?
I didn't hear the last part. Could you say the last part again?
At the time that Israel was founded, if I was a resident in that area, what would be my ability to participate in the new state, regardless of my, I was resident, my family had been resident, and the new state came into being. Did I have the ability, as a resident at the time, to be a democratic participant in the new state?
Let's begin with this.
My understanding is that it would have depended on where you are, because not one thing can't be said happened in every single place. The Nakba is how the Palestinians refer to the founding of Israel, because what you need to understand is when Israel was declared a state, during the basically last half of 1947 and the first half of 1948, approximately 750,000 Palestinians were driven from the land. Some were killed, some ended up in refugee camps. So in some places where, like I said, these were places that prior to the Zionist movement, people lived together in as much harmony as anywhere else in the world. So there were places where people banded together and people stayed. There were places where there, weren't great violence and massacres, where people were allowed to stay. So not one thing is true of everybody who was there at that time.
Can I address that?
Sami, and then-
Well, basically Israel is the only country in the world where they have citizenship and nationality. So if you happen to be one of those Palestinians who remained in the 1948 borders, at some point you became a citizen, you could vote, etc. But you're not a Jewish national. So you have to be Jewish to be part of the Jewish national. And they get all kind of the Jewish National Fund, assistance from the state. They go only to the nationals of Israel, not the citizens of Israel. And this is it's a very clever duplicity that they have been managed to find loopholes. They probably have some very good lawyers who created all this facade while convincing the world, oh, we're a democratic country, we have equal rights, and etc. But you take Jerusalem, for example. The citizens of Jerusalem who are Palestinians. I have a nephew who was born in Jerusalem. His father's from Jerusalem. He's 18 years old right now. He doesn't have a passport. He doesn't have an identification because he's not Jewish. While somebody from Brooklyn or West Hollywood or wherever, or Australia or Timbuktu, who is Jewish, can come to Israel, immediately become a citizen and a national and be afforded housing, etc., 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 simply because he was accidentally born a Jew. This is not fair. This is not Jewish. I think one of the biggest sources of anti-Semitism today, which Mr. Ratner alluded to, are the policies of the State of Israel. I mean, this is a clear-cut situation where if the Jewish state does all these bad things, it's natural for the world and others say, well, Jews are bad, etc. But I always resist that. I always make a distinction when I speak with people that Jews are one thing, she's an honorable Jew, she's an honorable Jew. A lot of honorable Jews who will fight for your rights, regardless whether you're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. Zionists are a different story. It's just like the relationship between Caucasians and the KKK. There's no other way to put it. If you're Jewish, you're white. If you're Zionist, then you're a KKK. That's the way I look at it.
Gary?
Where do I start? First of all, the people who stay, first of all, the vast majority of the Palestinian, actually they were Arab people, who were there in 1947, 1948, left because they were told to by the Arab leadership and by Husseini, who was the Palestinian leader, to leave because there was going to be an invasion, and there was an invasion of 7 Arab countries to wipe out the nascent state of Israel. And they were told, leave, and you'll be back in a couple weeks. Now there were some, this was a war, there were some, I will admit, and the Israelis will admit, there were some incidents, Deir Yassin is one, there's others, where there were horrible things that happened, but horrible things happened in war. And it happened. Huh? Massacres, and there were massacres of Jews too, by the Arabs. On the other hand, there were those who choose to stay. If you go to the town of Abu Ghosh, for instance, which is very close to Jerusalem, an Israeli Arab town, all those people chose to stay. They fought on the side of the Jewish state against their Arab brothers because they saw the benefits of living in Israel. And the people who lived there, to answer your question, if you were an Arab and living in Haifa, as some of my friends' parents did, they stayed there, they got full citizenship, they can vote in the Knesset, they have rights that are protected by the Israeli Supreme Court. Nothing's perfect. Israel's a messy, democratic place, just like a lot of democratic places are. I'm not trying to paint it as a utopia where all the problems and everything's hunky-dory. There's lots of problems, but there's the rule of law. And I don't know whether Estee was alluding to this or not when she was talking about Benin and other places, but the Israeli Supreme Court many times has forced the Israeli government to change the path of the anti-terror law to...
Have they done that?
Huh?
Have they adhered to those?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As an Arab Israeli, you can go to the Supreme Court. You've got your rights protected. There's an Arab Israeli Supreme Court justice. There's 20% of the Knesset is made up of Israeli Arabs with 3 or 4 political parties. Many who talk against Israel vehemently and who make alliances with Hamas, who were on the Gaza blockade boats. There's a lot more freedom than people realize. I would say, in my opinion, and I think any objective observer would say that the Israeli Arabs have a better situation than the Palestinian refugees certainly do in Lebanon or in Syria, where they have absolutely no rights whatsoever and are being treated by their Arab brothers in a horrible condition. I'd like to see you speak out against that and see, why aren't they treated that way? Why in Syria did Assad just recently use Palestinians to try to breach the border for his own purposes, and people got killed because of it? So, we look, nothing is perfect. And Israel is, the United States, it took years and years. We had slavery in this country, and blacks still don't have full rights. Latinos still don't have full rights. We just had women in the early 1900s got their full rights. So it's a work in progress, and it's the rule of law, and those of a goodwill are trying to make it better.
Three really quick points. It's true that the Israeli high courts have seen places where they have ruled that the wall should be moved. In most of those cases, it has yet to happen. As far as the notion that it was Arab nations that told Palestinians, you must leave, there were proud Israelis who became great students. They have a wonderful education system. And in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when they went abroad to study and to do their masters and their doctorates, they wanted to do projects on specific parts of Israeli history that they were proud of. And when they went to the museum in England, where they have all the records of all the radio broadcasts ever, they themselves were shocked to find out that there was no record anywhere of that ever happening. Radio would have been the only means for those calls to be made. So it's one of those things that just didn't happen, like the slogan that was used, a land without people for people without a land. Nice slogan, there were people on the land. And lastly, to address what's happening as far as what happens to the non-Jews who are there, there's several laws working their way through the Israeli courts, which are very, very terrifying for those who favor democracy. And one of them is that the Palestinians or the non-Jewish residents would have to take an oath, a loyalty oath to the state. There's other ones that deal with other things. There's a law that's just been passed that declares that Israelis, anyone within Israel who promotes the idea of a boycott or a sanction or a divestment campaign can be arrested.
It's a crime.
It's now a crime.
None of these bills have passed, number one.
The boycott one has.
No, it hasn't.
Okay,
60.
maybe just one more question and then we have time. Who is next? Go ahead.
Good evening. It's very difficult for me to sit here. Actually, I just listened to Mr. Ratner repeat the Hasbara propaganda that Israel has been promoting for 62 years. But there's a book that Sami have mentioned, and I really recommend it very highly, and that is written by an Israeli Jewish person who's a historian, respected historian, and professor of history, that chose to desert Israel and live in England. And this book called The Forgotten Palestinian, to answer the gentleman's question of the condition that the Palestinian has to sustain and suffer through those years, And in spite of what Mr. Ratner is trying to promote and say, which is really perplexing to me, how can the Zionist movement for 62 years maintain the same attitude, yet in the other side of their mouth is speak about peace? Yet they are bashing, they are incarcerating, they are killing, they are throwing any person of the Palestinian descent that dare to speak even of peace peacefully without armament. Of course, there's an armament, struggle that has been taking place. But this book by Alan Ferdman is based totally on information that is being released by the Israeli government in 2006 after so many years of seeing documents that is all in the book. So it tells you this propaganda, it has no place. We have so many decent Jewish people. Why do we need to be silent about what the Zionists trying to kidnap and blackmail all the Jewish community in that form and manner? It's just perplexing, and Mr. Ratner keeps sitting here and repeating the same thing again and again.
I'll give you to respond very quickly.
First of all, you're talking about Alan Pape, who has been discredited many, many times, who is such a fringe person that it's almost laughable to read his book and take any value out of it. A more legitimate person is Benny Morris, who originally had very many similar attitudes, and since through further research has written a new book in which he totally has changed his views.
The new research is called a pressure in the inside by the Zionists. That's all it is.
I'm just talking about the person who wrote the book.
It's documented, Mr.
There's
Ratner.
many books. But George Orwell had a great saying. He said, there are some ideas that are so wrong that only a very intelligent person could believe in them. So some of the myths and misconceptions and lies that are being told about the Zionists, I think, apply to what George Orwell is saying. The Zionist movement is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And I think as liberal Democrats and people who support the liberation of people all over, why aren't the Jewish people afforded the same thing? If you treat the Jewish people differently, I call that not only anti-Jewishism, but anti-Semitism. And that's what's happening in the world today. There's a one standard for everybody else, and there's another standard for Israelis and Jews. And it's time to call a spade a spade.
May I respond?
Excuse me, can we listen to him? You got your floor, please let him talk.
You know, even Goldstone has now retracted what he said about the Gaza war. I had a cousin who was a helicopter pilot during the Gaza war, and I'm so proud of him that, and the morals of the Israeli army and the rules are such that you can't bomb a place where Hamas leaders were using women and children as human shields. And he wasn't able, he was told, and the laws are that you can't bomb. And any Israeli soldier that breaks those laws is brought up on charges. And there's many Israeli soldiers, I shouldn't say many, there's a few Israeli soldiers who have broken the laws of Israel and are sitting in jail. So Israel's a country of rule of law.
Thank you so much.
I just want to say one point about
Very briefly, sir.
The definition of Zionism. He defines it as the national liberation movement for the Jewish people. Okay. I think the definition of movements has to be done by not the people who advocate the position, but the people who are affected by it. Now, how do we define Nazism? It's a racist, most horrible movement in history. Just ask Hitler and the Nazis what they defined it. That's all.
I still want
No, it's okay.
I think there is a question.
Okay. I had two questions, one for Mr. Mashney.
Can we get only one, please?
Well, okay, it's the same question basically. You seem to indicate that you were talking about something in the neighborhood of a single state solution towards the end of your talk. You said something was available. Is that what you're promoting, is a single state?
100%.
And for Ms. Chandler, outlined all these wonderful things that may happen in the case of peace. But just how are any of these things supposed to happen when the most simple thing, such as taking the destruction of Israel out of the charter of Hamas and Fatah, cannot be accomplished? They've been asked time and again, and yet they refuse to take it. How can anyone make peace with a state that's unwilling to do so?
I would say that the question is always asked, will they recognize Israel as a state? Will they recognize Israel's right to exist? Will they recognize Israel as a Jewish state? Never has Israel recognized the Palestinian state's right to exist.
Yes, it has. It's not true.
Again, we give you a chance.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah,
It
go ahead.
actually hasn't, and that's why I make the point that the thing that we see throughout history that has created change are nonviolent resistance movements. And that's why I really, really implore you to pay attention to these nonviolent movements that are happening. It's not something that's just happening with Palestinians. Like I said, there are wonderful, wonderful Israelis who are out there and internationals who are out there side by side with them every Friday. Every Friday you can go on the internet, you can see, the struggle and to create change, because you're right, if everybody hunkers down, you have no progress.
May I address his question, this one? Sir, you're asking the Palestinians to recognize Israel. Why not ask Israel, which obliterated Palestine, erased it from the map completely, to first undo what it has done, and then when the victim catches its breath and able to talk and just be familiar with the new circumstances, ask them at that point to recognize Israel. Why do you ask the victim to recognize the villain? If you have a home invasion robbery, somebody comes to your home, beats you up, beats your wife, slaps around your children, would you, and then somebody asks you, you have to recognize, you have to pay homage to me. This is exactly when you ask the Palestinians to recognize Israel first. That's the historical context. And it's unfair to do.
Gary?
Well, I guess I would just ask, there's all kinds of materials that I brought that I think are very historically accurate. I hope that on your way out you'll pick up some of those materials and study them and make your own judgment about what's the real reality of the history, the real reality of what's going on today, and what are the real possibilities for moving forward for peace. Because we all want peace, and I applaud, even though we have severe disagreements. I know that in his heart, his ultimate goal is peace, and I know Estee's ultimate goal is peace. My ultimate goal is peace. I've been accused of not wanting peace. I want peace more than anybody else. I have relatives who live there. I live part of the year in Israel. Nothing more. When I go to Sderot and I have to run into a shelter every 15 minutes because a Katyusha rocket's coming over my head, that's no way to live. So we want peace more than anybody, and we got to find a way to get there. And I think it starts with the end of incitement and hatred of the Jewish people and the Israeli people by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas.
We have a last question.
I actually don't have much of a question. It's sort of more a part of each of you are doing some sort of closing statements, but I don't know how much everybody in the audience knows about this issue and how much you've read up on it, and the conversation got pretty adversarial pretty quickly and into a lot of details that I don't think everybody understands, and it quickly degenerates into a he said, she said, back and forth. And so I've had the privilege of being in Israel and in the West Bank each of the last 2 years, which was an amazing experience for me and really helped me get a handle on sort of what I believe on this issue, and I would strongly encourage all of you to go if you get the opportunity. As American citizens, you can travel throughout the West Bank freely and really learn a lot by being there. But short of that, I was actually hoping that each of you, I know that there's some information here, and I know part of Stand With Us, their mission is to sort of fight what they view as, misunderstandings and miseducation about what's going on there. And I know that JVP has a similar mission. And so I was hoping that each of you could just take a minute and maybe recommend a couple of sources, for people to sort of learn a little bit and educate themselves, short of being able to actually travel to Israel and elsewhere.
Well, likewise, I have some information on our table, but one of the things that I'm most proud of about JVP is our amazing website. We have a wonderful website at jvp.org. We have some great bloggers who keep up to date on what's going on. There's a lot of historical reference there, and I encourage everybody to check out our website at Jewish Voice for Peace or jvp.org.
We have many websites. One of the websites I wish you'd go to is www.sayyes2peace.org. And I think you'll find a lot of interesting information there. If you really want to get and delve into the issue, there's a pamphlet there called Israel 101. If you don't want to get that involved, there's a little booklet called Pocket Facts. There's many things. I would also suggest reading Alan Dershowitz's The Case for Israel.
You don't have to end it on a note about leadership. But we dub him as the torture professor because he advocated torture. But anyway, the best source is the internet, because the TV and the major newspaper are filtered by Zionist editors and owners. I mean, how often do you see stuff on TV where the Arabs are bad and the Israelis and Jews are good? I mean, this is the pattern. But Hollywood, how many movies have you seen denigrating? Marlon Brando, he said it about 7-8 years ago, that we see movies about the kikes, the Chinese, the blacks, the Indians, this and this and this and this and that. There was never one single movie that came out from Hollywood that denigrates Jewish people. So there is media control in the United States. So if you don't believe it, then you've been asleep or you're in denial. So the internet is the best source. Just go on the internet, Facebook, etc., see short videos, see books. It's a free flow of information, and you get the truth more because it's popularized media. It's not media controlled by the oligarchs or just a few tycoons who control. They give you what they think that you must know rather than what you actually need to know. Thank you.